Hello, and welcome to my latest video on Trey Jadlow. Yay! Today I will be discussing Trey Jadlow's interaction with Floyd Fp and Fox in the Know, which could be found in the description bar below. The first thing to open with are the criticisms. The first criticism I have is there was far too much time discussing whether or not the argument Trey Jadlow was presenting was science. It was not. If pure deduction is a science, then Sherlock Holmes is a book about a scientist, and I don't think anyone would argue that point. Furthermore, science is mostly about empirical observation once the presuppositions necessary for science have been laid down. Things like sense perception and rational coherence are presupposed in science. They are not inferred in science. The next thing is the throwing of incredulity. Never throw incredulity. Never throw your hands up in exasperation when somebody quizzes you or grills you. The best thing you can do is calm down, try to explain it to the best of your capability, and then if you're really hard-pressed and can't answer, be happy to say, I don't really know how I can formulate it at this juncture. Maybe I should study up on this some more, quote other people, and come back to continue the discussion. The next thing is you do not define your terms, Trey. Please define your terms. I will define my terms in this video when I defend your argument better than you do. The next thing is the throwing of ad hominems, criticizing people's understanding of philosophy when you yourself also do not understand a lot of philosophy. Otherwise, you would have caught a lot of basic points that you missed out. Without any further ado, this is Trey's argument. If I know I exist, then I happen to exist. If I happen to exist, then I was caused to exist. If I was caused to exist, the only sufficient thing to explain my existence is something non-contingent itself and of pure actuality. Premise 4. I know I exist, thus affirming P in the first premise. Then, from anything that it entails, that also follows. So therefore you know you happen to exist. Otherwise, you would have to feign solipsism or argue for your immortality. Either of those options are not epistemically defensible. The next conclusion is you were caused to exist by something else. That would mean that because you came into existence, you have to defer to something else outside of that. The third part of the conclusion is the only sufficient thing to explain your existence is something non-contingent and pure actuality. While some skeptics might be quick to throw out their parents, prior causal orders, and cosmology up until the B theory of time, or an infinite past, I would have to say for those who are willing to do that, that just extends it to also include these other things, because the Aristotelian or Thomist, or Aristotelian Thomist, there are hybrids, would argue that those things in themselves are not sufficient to explain your own existence. And this thing that is sufficient is called God. Why? I'll get to that in a minute once we define the terms. Things to touch upon or define. This is the section where I touch upon and define things. Actuality, that which is obtained. This hat is actually green, is actually made of a harsh fabric that I do not know of right now. It has tons of properties, which it actually is. Potency, that which is obtained, i.e. the hat, what it can become. It can become ashes. You can cut it up into little pieces. You can freeze it. Some potencies would make this cease being a hat. Other potencies would not. Things that are pure actuality, as opposed to just having actuality, are things which have no potency. They cannot become anything else due to the requirements of their nature. or being pure actuality. Once you are pure actuality, you cannot become a hat or anything lesser than you are. You essentially boil down to a simplicity of actuality. This goes into our next word, which was heavily abused by Trey Jadlow, which is contingency. Something in the Aristotelian and Thomistic doctrine which is contingent is not having its existence by virtue of its own nature. This hat, by being a hat, did not become a hat because it is a hat. Or, hats don't exist because they are hats, to put it simply. Rather, hats exist because there are hat manufacturers and makers. They presuppose fabric, they presuppose greenness. There are tons of properties which combine to make hats. Furthermore, so those are the material causes. Furthermore, there are efficient causes because we know of hat manufacturers. We know that hats don't occur in nature but require artificers, things with hats in mind, and the like. It has specific sets of purposes which go over our heads as such. And of course, they're to serve the creative and fashion impulses of humanity, the final causes, if you will. Causes are also another term that have been abused. To say cause is not its mechanical initiator. For example, if I cause this hat, that would be the efficient cause. That would be reason to explain the hat insofar as what brought it into existence, but not the materials themselves which combine to make it, not the purpose to its existence, and not the structure itself. Those reasons combine to be causes. The final formal, material, and efficient causes. For more concise definitions, they will be below. So to say you're contingent is to say that you have potency, that you have cause, and other things. It's to say that you don't exist by the necessity of your own nature. Necessity, however, is to exist by what you are. Now, with that in mind, there should be a distinguish between contingency and necessity as it's presented metaphysically in the Thomistic doctrine and the Aristotelian doctrine, and as it's presented in modal logic. In modal logic, something is necessary if it doesn't entail a logical contradiction, to say it does exist. Or, to put it simply, if it's an incoherent idea, not to exist, then you're necessarily existent. However, in modal logic, if you say that something is contingent, that means it is possible that it did not come into existence, logically speaking. So metaphysically, God exists, necessarily, at least on the argument. But it's to say that if there was any other metaphysical reality, if instead of Aristotelian metaphysics being true, there was some other metaphysical system that was true, God would not exist. And that is the case. If you were to refute notions of actuality, potency, Aristotelian contingency, or anything necessary to create the Aristotelian metaphysical worldview, then you are right, God would not exist. But because we think that the metaphysics of Aristotle rightfully capture the world itself, then necessarily we are committed to God's existence. This brings us to essence, or nature, that which it is. This hat is a hat. This particular hat instantiates the universal of hatness. Hatness itself is something we could talk about, and that is something that is in essence. But existence is to have existence. I could have notions of hats in my head that do not exist. The notion of a non-existent hat is possible. There were times when there were no hats. So the essence and existence are not something that are the same in the hat, but are distinct. But this is where we get to the ground of all being. Something is the ground of all being if its essence is its existence. That means those two are identical. There is no distinction there. And it's associated with things of pure actuality because things of pure actuality are things that have no potency to change. These two ways of looking at God are both valid because of the fact that they are consistent with one another and even require one another. One is obtained through looking at an act-potency distinction, the other is obtained through looking at an essence-existence distinction. So with that in mind, why does such a thing get called God? Well, this goes to the principle of proportional causality, which is something has to exist in the cause greater to than it exists in the effect. Because human minds are an effect of God, and because nothing in the material world suffices to explain it, because Thomists and Aristotelians are kind of wedded to an immateriality of the mind or the soul, and this must come from God. So if everything in the mind, such as knowledge, such as goodness, which we think humans are capable of, that is deficient in God, then such a being could not be the cause, but it is. So goodness, knowledge must exist greater in God. Furthermore, power is the capacity to be controlled by such other things. For something to control the pure act of being, it would have to suffice to bring out some potency in a way, which is impossible. And with that, I end my video. I hope it was enlightening.